up, everybody, and welcome back to a brand new episode of Brewing with 50 Bucks. This is the show where we take your favorite commanders, we slap on a $50 budget, and not only do we build a deck that is functional, but one that is also able to win you the game. My name is Stefan, I'm coming to you from the General Warfare headquarters. I'm glad you can make it today. So, we're 1 week removed from the release of Commander Legends Battle for Baldur's Gate. This is actually my favorite set to come out this year. I find that New Capenna kind of had a couple of cool things, but not enough to keep my interest, and I feel like Kamigawa Neon Dynasty just breezed right through the year, kind of like how Kaldheim did last year. But that being said, we're going to be focusing on today's set, which is going to be Battle for Baldur's Gate. Now, I actually went to the pre-release a couple of weeks ago, and I absolutely loved it. It just showed why I love Commander. A lot of the builds you can do with just 2-card pairing, especially with the new background mechanics, which are really, really cool. And I've actually play tested with a couple of my buddies on Cockatrice, and I've seen the actual effects that some of these backgrounds can actually have. Today's deck tech is not going to be a one with a background. It's going to be one of the tricolor ones. If you want to see me cover a deck, make a deck tech, or cover a commander with the background mechanic, let me know in the comments down below. But in today's deck tech, we're going to be taking a look at our commander today, which is Miirym, Sentinel Wurm. Now, immediately following the brew for the Council of 4, I actually whipped up this deck. This is a really fun deck that I decided just to slap a couple of dragons around, and ultimately speaking, once I was doing the research for this deck, I found out that this is probably not only the most popular tricolor commander, this is also the most popular commander in the set to build, comprising of over almost 1,000 decks at the current recording time. And overall, this is just an excellent dragon commander with loads of fun options and a lot of different ways you can create copies off of. So let's not waste any more time and let's go into the commander breakdown and the deck strategy.
So Miirym Sentinel Wurm is a 6/6 for 3 green, blue, and red, so 3 and Temur, for a legendary dragon spirit with flying and ward 2, aka hexproof 2, and the ability whenever another non-token dragon enters the battlefield under your control, create a token that's a copy of it, except the token isn't legendary if that dragon is legendary. Now, obviously speaking, this is a really strong card, for 6/6 for 6 with flying and the ability to keep itself protected. But we're building around that secondary ability to have dragons come into the play, non-token dragons come into play and get another copy off them. So our deck strategy is to ramp into Miirym, get some flying reptiles on board and either value off it or swing in the air for a gigantic win. And as always, we brew these decks with a budget of around $50, which includes the price of the commander and excludes the price of the basic lands. And for this, we also offer a $5 overage compromise. So this compromise is set for those who can spend like $5 extra. Most of you can if you're building a $50 deck, but this is just a guaranteed way to basically have a little bit of available pocket change for those who can spare the extra $5. The link to the deck list will be in the show notes down below, and if I can ask of you guys for something real quick, just please like this video if you like this kind of content, subscribe to the channel, and hit that bell icon so you can be notified of every single video that comes out of the channel. Thank you very much. So we're going to be going over the standard array of categories. For this one, I actually wanted to spice it up, but ran out of time to do so. So we're going to be doing the basic categories of our instants, our artifacts, our planeswalkers, our lands, our creatures, our enchantments, and our sorceries. And as always with these videos, we like to start off with the most cumbersome of categories. In this case, this is a very creature-based deck, so we're going to start off with our creatures. We're running roughly 21 creatures, which is about over a fifth of our deck, roughly, and it'll show, as you'll see as we go down the list, as to why this deck is very creature-focused. Let's start off our list with Atarka World Render. Now, this is not going to be a dragon deck without Atarka, because Atarka is key in giving our dragons double strike whenever they attack. It itself has flying and trample, and it also gives itself double strike because the wording is whenever a dragon, not whenever another dragon you control attacks. So Atarka will effectively give himself double strike. Just giving all your dragons double strike is just an amazing ability, and I love the fact that Atarka is now budget enough to put in this deck. Next up is Brudiclad, Telcor Engineer. This is an interesting card, as I figured this was going to be an interesting deck to build around, so I wanted to add this in, even though his price point is a little bit high and his CMC is a little higher at that. But ultimately, creature tokens you control have haste, so whenever we're making tokens off Miirym, they'll have the ability to attack. The best part about this is that at the beginning of combat on your turn, you create a 2/1 blue mirrored artifact creature token. Then you can choose a token you control, and if you do, each other token you control becomes a copy of that token. So you'll see in just a little bit of all the available tokens we can make with this deck. But to give you an example, let's just say we have already made a token of Atarka, World Render. With that, we're going to have a myriad of tokens that are just Atarka World Render, that are all non-legendary, that are 6/4s with flying and trample, and they'll give themselves double strike. That's going to be a lot of damage.
Oh, that's a lot of damage!
Next up is Dragon Muralist. Now, I decided to add this one in as a little tutor card for whenever it dies. You can search your library for a dragon card and reveal it and put it into your hand, then shuffle. It's just a cool little tutor I decided to add in here because we don't have too many ways to search our deck here, so Dragon Muralist is a welcome addition, especially the fact that Miirym could make a token copy of it, and whenever it dies, you can just search up for another dragon for however many Dragon Muralist or Dragon Muralist tokens you have on the field at the time. Next up is Dragonborn Champion. This one is awesome because whenever a source you control deals 5 or more damage to a player, draw a card. The majority of our creatures have over 5 power. This is going to be a no-brainer for us to get some extra card draw off our dragons hitting our opponents. And this is whenever a source, so it'll be multiple instances of that card draw as well. Dragon Lord Servant is next, and this is just a cost reducer. Your dragon spells are going to cost 1 less. And who doesn't want to play their commander for 1 less mana? Emerald Dragon is next, and this is probably one of the cards I absolutely adored from Baldur's Gate, as not only is this a 4/4 flying trample for 6 mana, but its ability is hilarious to say the least. It's a green stifle, I should say, because the ability for 3 mana is to counter target activated or triggered ability from a non-creature source. Planeswalker loyalty abilities, artifacts, and enchantments that have mana abilities. This just turns them off immediately, and then you can adventure it into that 4/4 flying trample dragon. Next up is Furkrag, the Cunning Instigator. So this is an interesting one. It's a 5 mana dragon that's a 3/3. Doesn't really get to the threshold that our Dragonborn Champion wants us to, but don't let looks deceive you, as this has flying and haste when it comes on the field. 2 really good abilities. Whenever 1 or more dragons you control attack an opponent, go to that target creature that player controls. That's going to be key. And whenever a creature deals combat damage to one of your opponents, if that creature had to attack this combat, you put a +1/+1 counter on Furkrag, Cunning Instigator, and you draw a card. Imagine the fact that you're going to have Brudiclad on the field and copying Furkrag God knows how many times. All your opponent's creatures are going to be goated, and they can't attack you if able. So, with that, your opponents are going to be attacking each other, and you're going to be benefiting off those +1/+1 counters coming onto Furkrag, and you're going to be drawing those extra cards as well. Next up is Fyndhorn Elves. This is just a mana dork that I wanted to add in here just for an extra green mana to make some extra mana. Ganax Astral Hunter is great and is next in that exact order. And so, whenever it or another dragon enters the battlefield, you create a treasure token. For the fact that it's a non-common and it gives you treasure tokens whenever a dragon comes into play, I feel like the actual price on this card is a little surreal, as I'm expecting this card to jump up in price very, very soon, as I'm actually building this deck in real life myself. But that being said, whenever a dragon enters the battlefield under your control, you create a treasure token. Your dragon tokens will make treasure tokens. Whenever you blink them, they'll make treasure tokens. And Miirym will make copies of them that'll get extra treasure tokens. So you're gonna have treasure tokens for days with Ganax on the field. Next up is Imrith, Desert Doom. This is one of the dragons I remember talking about last year from our first D&D set, Adventures in the Forgotten Realm. And with this, it has Ward 4 as long as it's untapped, which is a little innocuous, but let me continue in here. But whenever it deals combat damage to a player, draw a card, and if you have fewer than 3 cards in hand, draw equal to the difference. So, not only when it deals combat damage does it let you draw a card, it's a 5 mana beater too, so it'll draw you a card, and if you have less than 3 cards in hand, you draw the difference. This is just absolutely great to fill up your hand. And have a 5/5 practically unkillable creature as long as you're not attacking with it, or as long as you can give it vigilance. Corlessa Scale Singer is next. This is just utility in our deck. It's not going to be a great card for attacks, but basically you can just look at the top card of your library anytime and you can cast dragons from the top of your library. It's just great tech, really. That's the reason we're adding Corlessa in this deck, and it's an uncommon dragon, so you're not going to expect a high price to pay for this kind of little dragon bard. Llanowar Elves fits into the same category as Findhorn Elves, just a little mana dork that could produce a green mana and help us cast some of our bigger spells. Lozan Dragon's Legacy is next. This is a great card as well. It has flying, and whenever you cast an adventure or dragon spell, it'll deal damage equal to that spell's mana value to any target that isn't a commander. So, ultimately speaking, you can have Miirym on the field, and you can start slinging around six damage to one of your opponents or one of your opponent's creatures at any time with Lozan. Well, whenever you can cast them. And that being said, it's specified to cast, so your dragons coming into play will not trigger Lozan, unfortunately. Obsidian Charmaw is next, and this is just an absolutely funny card I decided to add in the deck. This is from Modern Horizons, I believe Modern Horizons 2. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, editor. But basically, flying costs less for each land your opponents control that could produce a colorless. The Enter the Battlefield ability is just it's just hilarious. Just destroy target non-basic land an opponent controls. We're looking at you, Maze's End players. Basically, Obsidian Charmaw, it will just be the difference maker for any deck that's playing around land-based strategies. Rattleclaw Mystic is another mana dork we're going to add into this deck as well. This comes in play as a 2/1, and it's going to come in with 1 extra mana to cast it, but it gives you the range to cast your commander's colors. So it gives you red, it gives you blue, and it gives you green, and you can actually morph it, and when it turns face up, you add all 3 of those colors as well. Renari, Merchant of Marvels is next, and this is a great card to add in too because you can cast dragon spells and artifact spells as though they had flash. You know, if you've watched these videos before, you know my absolute love for flash and for playing things at instant speed, because not only does it give you the upper hand when it comes to instant speed interactions, but especially so, your opponents, apart from seeing Renari on the field, won't know what's coming their way as long as you're playing dragons or artifacts. And we're going to be running into our artifacts very soon, so stick around for those. Sapphire Dragon is next. This is a interesting card as well, as this comes in as its instant Psionic Pulse, where that could counter a target non-creature spell, basically a negate for 1 extra mana. But on its creature side, it's a 7 mana 5/6 with flying, and whenever it attacks or blocks, you get to scry 2. So ultimately, you have a counterspell on a dragon, and a dragon that's a 5/6. That whenever it attacks or blocks, you get to look at the top 2 cards of your library and see if you like them or not. This I really like. Curve of it is a little wonky for the 7 mana, but ultimately speaking, I love the card, even if it's just going to be used as an extra negate on your side of the field. Savage Ventmaw is next. This is just an all-around great card to add into any Gruul or any deck that has red and green in it, especially big beaters, as whenever it attacks, you add 3 red and 3 green, and until end of turn, you don't lose the mana as steps and phases end. The fact that we have Miirym on the field and that can make clones of it, and the fact we have Brutaclad that can make all of our tokens just turn into Savage Ventmaws, we're gonna have a crap ton of mana to deal with. Granted, it's not gonna be blue mana, it's gonna be red and green, but keep in mind, this is for each Savage Ventmaw that's attacking. So even if you have 2, that's 12 mana you're gaining off it, and that is such amazing gains. Scaled Nurturer is next. This I'm adding as a mana dork as well. It just gives you a green mana, unfortunately, but whenever you spend it to cast a dragon spell, you gain 2 life. So you get a little bit of life gain off it as well. It's not going to be completely significant, as it's just getting 2 mana. If it was something like you gain life to the converted mana cost or mana value, however you want to word it, that would be absolutely broken. But the 2 life is going to be pretty good as a starting point. It is going to help us cast our dragons easily. Thrakkus the Butcher is next. Don't be surprised. you knew this one was going to be coming in. This is just an absolute monster of a card because it has trample. It doesn't have flying like the rest of our dragons, but it has trample, and whenever it attacks, you double the power of each dragon you control until end of turn. So as long as you can get Thrakkus flying or some form of evasion, you can just double the power of each dragon, including Thrakkus himself, and you can just swing out for a game-ending victory. And the last of our creatures is Thunderbeak Regent. Now, I decided to add this in because of its ability, and it's because it protects our creatures. Because whenever a dragon control becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, the Regent deals 3 damage to that player. So anytime our creatures are being targeted for any reason, whether it be a kill spell, whether it be exile, or anything of the sorts, basically the Thunderbeak will just zap the opponent for that 3 damage. It's a lightning bolt on a creature, basically. Our next category is going to be our instants. As I mentioned before, I absolutely love instant speed interaction in this deck, and I feel like having extra instant speed interaction is much better than just going at a snail's pace on your own turn. We're running 14 instants in this deck, and we're going to start off with Bane's Contingency. This is a new card from Battle for Baldur's Gate, and for 3 mana, you counter a target spell. If that spell targets a commander you control, instead you counter it and scry 2, then draw a card. Obviously speaking, not too many cards are going to be targeting a few cards might be targeting our commander, but in the instance where we have Bane's Contingency, the second part of that is kind of situational at best. So at worst, you're getting a counter spell for 3 mana. At best, you're getting something that counters a spell. You get to look at the top 2 cards of your deck, see if they like them, and then you get to draw a card as the aftermath. Next is Beast Within, and basically, say it with me if you know this one. Destroy target permanent. Its controller creates a 3/3 green beast creature token. Brainstorm is next. Basically, it's just going to be a quick way for us to draw some extra cards and then put the top 2 cards from your hand on top of your library in any order. So basically some filtering going on right over here. Breath Weapon is next, and I decided to add this as just a fun little card, as Breath Weapon will deal 2 damage to each non-dragon creature. This is basically added for flavor, ultimately speaking, but come on, wiping your opponent's little weenies off the face of the earth when you have an entire army of dragons at your side of the field, I don't see how that would be any problem at all. Next is Cloth's Will, and you get to choose one, but if you control your commander, you can choose both. You can either breathe Flame, that'll deal X damage to each creature without flying, or you can smash rallies and destroy up to X target artifacts and or enchantments, or if you control Miirym, you do both. Now, I decided to add this in because Breathe Flame does not hit our dragons at all. Well, most of them. Ultimately speaking, the destroy up to X target artifacts and enchantments is just really good if you're trying to nullify and just cripple one of your opponents. And I absolutely love it, and most of the time when I'm playing Cloth's Will, I want to have Miirym on the field, so that way I can get 2 for 1 on this one. Magna Quake is next. It deals X damage to each creature without flying on each planeswalker. Again, you can copy paste what I mentioned about Cloth's Will on here, especially the Breathe Flame part. It's just going to be easy for us to just wipe our opponent's fields, take out their planeswalkers if needed, and get in some extra damage while our dragons still have that flying. Negate is next. It's a staple blue card that just for 2 mana you get to counter target non-creature spell. Planar Incision is next, and this is just kind of an interesting card that I decided to add in last minute. Basically, you exile target artifact or creature, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control with a +1/+1 counter on it. So basically, you can supplant one of your dragons if they're getting targeted for removal. You can do it, exile them, they come onto the battlefield with an extra +1/+1 counter. And if you have Miirym on the field, basically you can make an extra clone copy of it and basically get some value off all the value you're getting off your creatures. Reality Shift is next. You get to exile a creature and then its controller manifests the top card of their library. Pretty straightforward blue card I see a lot in Commander games, and especially with blue. But in reality, no pun intended, this is actually just a really good card to have in any blue deck. Silumgar's Scorn is next. This is an interesting card I decided to add because for one, you can reveal a dragon card as an additional cost, and then basically you counter a spell unless its controller pays 1, but if you did reveal a dragon, just counter the spell instead. Most of our hand is going to be comprised of dragons, so the rare occasion that you're playing Silumgar's Scorn for 2 blue mana without a dragon is very slim. Spit Flame is next. Again, another flavorful card. Basically, it'll deal 4 damage to any target creature.
And whenever a dragon enters the battlefield under your control, you can pay a red and you can return Spit Flame from your graveyard to your hand. So this is a repeatable potential removal for your opponent's creatures. Basically, you deal 4 damage to any creature and then just play a dragon and pay an extra red to get it back to your hand. And you can just do it again for 3 mana. Stubborn Denial is next. This is great as we can counter a non-creature spell if its controller pays 1, but if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, you can counter that spell instead entirely. The majority of our creatures in this deck, the base power is 4, so it's not going to be a problem to meet the requirement for Ferocious and just counter the spell for 1 blue mana. Wild Magic Surge is next. This is just a really funny card I wanted to add in this deck as well, and it's a new card from Battle of Baldur's Gate, as it'll destroy target permanent an opponent controls, and then basically the opponent reveals a card from the top of their library until they reveal a permanent card that shares a card type with that permanent. They can put that card into the battlefield and then put the rest in the bottom of their library in a random order. So, ultimately speaking, I think it's like Tybalt's Trickery, if I remember correctly. But with this, basically, this gives the ability for red to destroy a permanent an opponent controls. This is the first time I'm actually seeing destroy target permanent in opponent controls. As a red player, this makes me undeniably happy that we finally have a way outside of Chaos Warp and outside of Tybalt's Trickery to actually interact with enchantments. So best believe I'm adding this into my red decks. And the last of our instance is Winged Portent. This is a card from Crimson Vow, and it has the cleave cost for green and a blue and 4 generic. But basically for its regular cost is you draw a card for each creature with flying you control. If you pay the cleave cost, which I don't know why you would, but in the case you want to pay the cleave cost, you draw a card for each creature you control. So our next 2 categories have the same amount of cards in them, so we're going to go off by alphabetical order, which will start off to be our artifacts. We're running about 10 artifacts, and we're running 10 of our next category as well. Let's go straight into it and hit up Basilisk Collar first. It's a 1 mana equipment with Equip 2 that gives our creatures Death Touch and Lifelink. This is amazing, especially the fact that it's now gone down in price, so you can add it into any one of your decks now. But with the fact that it gives us an extra bit of lifelink and it gives us a threatening ability with Death Touch, this is an absolute put-in for this kind of deck because a lot of the times there's gonna be a lot of targets going your way. So getting a bit of life back when you desperately need it is great strategy. Carnelian Orb of Dragonkind is next. It's one of the new mana rocks from this set where you basically get to add a color for the dragon, and then if that was spent to cast a dragon spell, an ability happens. In this case, you're adding red, and if you cast a dragon spell, it gains haste till end of turn. This is absolutely amazing to have with Miirym and any one of your dragons because you're going to be giving them haste. I don't know if there's going to remain budget for so long, so if you have the opportunity, pick up as many as you can and pick up foils because those are usually a lot more expensive. But with this, adding that extra mana and giving your dragons that extra ability is a godsend in this deck. Commander Sphere is next. This is an automatic staple I add in any one of our multicolored decks. In this, you're basically for 3 mana, you're adding 1 mana of any color of your commander's color identity. Sacrifice the spear to draw a card. Simple as such. Dragon's Horde is next, and whenever a dragon enters the battlefield under your control, you put a gold counter on the dragon horde, remove a gold counter from it, and draw a card. You basically get to tap it and add a mana of any color for 3 mana. This is just great because this is going to help us cast our dragons a lot better, and this interacts with our dragons coming into play, as it says whenever a dragon, which include the clone copies Miirym make with the rest of our dragons that are coming in, then you get those gold counters. You can remove a gold counter from the Dragon's Horde to draw some extra cards as well. Next up is Jade Orb of Dragonkind. You could copy paste what I said about the Carnelian Orb. In this case, you're adding a green, and when you spend mana to cast the dragon, it enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it, and it gains hexproof until your next turn. This is great. This is absolutely great. Giving our creatures +1/+1 is good, but the hexproof part is the reason why I added this in the deck. Giving your dragons hexproof is just insanely good, especially the fact that even if they want to target it after you cast it, they can't because you can't target it because of the hexproof. Next up is Mirror Box. This is a weird card to say the least, but let me read it out for you. It's 3 mana for an artifact where the legend rule does not apply to permanents you control. Each legendary creature you control gets +1/+1, and each non-token creature you control gets +1/+1 for each other creature you control with the same name as that creature.
This is obviously a situational card to put into any deck, but for this one, it worked perfectly because we're making so many clones, for one. Two, we're already getting that extra boost from that Anthem effect for legendary creatures, and if you've been paying attention, the majority of our creatures are legendary creatures, and especially so, the non-token dragons that will get an extra +1/+1 for each other clone of that creature. So supplanting it and basically blinking it is going to be fantastic, especially with the mirror box on the field. Next up is Orb of Dragonkind. This is another old card from Adventures in the Forgotten Realm, but basically for this, one, tap it to add 2 mana of any combination of colors. You can only cast dragon spells or activate dragon abilities with it, but for red, and tap it and sack the orb. You look at the top 7 cards of your library, you may reveal a dragon card from among them and then put it into your hand. Just put the rest at the bottom of your library in a random order. So this helps you get some extra dragons into your hand and helps you pay for some extra dragons to come onto the field. Pyre of Heroes is next. Initially, I wanted to make this a pod deck, but I found there was going to be too much of a curve, and all the cards that would be great to add into pod are going to be way too overpriced for this deck. So Pyre of Heroes is going to be our caveat for this one. So in this case, you get to sacrifice a creature and search your library for 2 mana and tap it, and search your library for a creature card that shares a creature type and the sacrifice creature, and the converted mana cost equal to 1 plus the creature's converted mana cost. Basically, from there, you could sacrifice one of your dragons to the Pyre of Heroes, just mind the casting cost for it, because it'll be 1 more from there. So if you're sacrificing a creature for 2 mana value, you have to get one that's 3, and then 4, and etc, etc, etc. In this case, this is just a great card to get some extra dragons on the field, and then if they're being targeted or if they've fulfilled their use already, just Pyre of Heroes it away. Soul Ring is next. It's standard in every commander deck known to man. 1 mana to play and tap it to add 2 colorless mana. And the last of our artifacts is Temur Banner. This is going to allow us to, for 3 mana to play, you just tap it to add a color for our commander's color identity, and then tap 3 of those colors, green, blue, and red, sacrifice the banner to draw a card. Our next category is our sorceries. So as I mentioned before, this has the same number of cards as our artifacts. We have about 10 sorceries in here. So let's get started immediately with Cultivate. Straight up standard card in any green deck. This card allows you to search for up to 2 basic lands, reveal them, put one onto the battlefield tapped, and then the other into your hand, so you could get some extra ramp off it. Next is Draconic Intervention. This is just absolutely flavor as well. Basically, at the additional cost to cast it, you have to exile an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard, so you have to make sure you have one of those in your graveyard before casting it. Draconic Intervention deals X damage to each non-dragon creature, where X is the exiled card's mana value. And if a creature dealt damage this way would die, you exile it instead, and then you exile the Draconic Intervention. Again, a complete flavor card, but for the fact that you can wipe your opponent's boards and then go in for a kill off it is just absolutely phenomenal. Farseek is next. It's another one of our ramp cards that allow us to fetch us either a mountain or an island to the field. Those are the only 2 relevant cards that we could actually get for us off Farseek. Genesis Ultimatum is next. Basically for 2 green, 2 red, and 3 blue, look at the top 5 cards of your library, put any number of permanent cards from among them onto the battlefield, the rest into your hand, and then exile the ultimatum. This works like any other ultimatum, but in this case, you get to put any permanents that you see from the top 5 of your library, put the rest in your hand, you put those permanents on the field, and then you profit off it. Kodama's Reach is next. Basically with this, you get to search your library for 2 basic lands, put one onto the battlefield, and then one into your hand. The exact same thing like Cultivate, just a copy paste of it. Neoform is next. This is another one of our pod cards, but with this, it's just a 2 mana sorcery that allows us to pod away our cards and then just search up for another one of our creatures. Next card I am very surprised went down in price is Rishkar's Expertise. This card was $6 the last time I saw it, and now it's roughly around $1, $1.50 or something like that. Basically with this, a 6 mana sorcery that allows you to draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures you control, and then you can cast a spell with convert with mana value 5 or less from your hand without paying the mana cost. This is just phenomenal card, ultimately speaking. You can just draw at the very least 6 cards off of Miirym, depending on how many +1/+1 card counters you're putting on Furkrag. Basically, you're gonna be drawing a myriad of cards, I would say, and then you could just play something for 5 mana, which is absolutely insane to me. Next up is See the Unwritten. This is another one of my favorite cards I desperately wanted to add in this deck. Basically, for 6 mana, you reveal the top 8 cards of your library, and you can put a creature card from among them onto the battlefield, put the rest in your graveyard. But with the Ferocious, again, it's not going to be hard for us to get Ferocious. You get to put 2 creatures from among those 8 cards onto the battlefield instead. This basically helps you cheat out a couple of your creatures onto the battlefield without even having to pay for their mana costs. Next up is Shamanic Revelation. This is just going to be another one of our Rush cards expertise, where you draw cards for each creature you control, and with the Ferocious, you gain 4 life for each creature you control with power 4 or greater. The last of our cards is Traverse the Outlands, where for 5 mana, you search your library for up to X basic land cards, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. Put those cards on the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle your library. So we're coming down to our last 3 categories for this deck. Starting off, it's going to be our enchantments. We're running about 7 enchantments in this deck. This is going to be probably one of our fewer amount of enchantment reliant decks. But for all the enchantments we are playing, they are going to pack a punch. Starting off with Acolyte of Bahamut. It's one of the new backgrounds we've seen from Baldur's Gate. With this, commander creatures you own have the first dragon spell you cast each turn costs 2 less to cast. This is going to help us greatly reduce the casting costs for our dragons in this deck, especially with that 2 mana caveat. Colossal Majesty is next. This is going to allow us to draw cards on our upkeep as long as we have a creature with power 4 or greater. Next is Dragon Tempest. This is easily the most expensive card in our deck, but for great reason, as whenever a creature with flying enters the battlefield under your control, it gains haste till end of turn. For 1, and 2, whenever a dragon enters the battlefield under your control, which is highly likely from what you see before, it deals X damage to target creature or player, where X is the number of dragons you control. So keep in mind, this is whenever a dragon, not non-token, dragon enters the battlefield, it'll deal X damage. So if you have Miirym on the field and let's just say you have an Imrith come onto play, with Miirym, it'll make the clone copy, so you'll have 2 triggers off both of the Dragon Tempest, both the gains haste and the dragon entering the battlefield. It'll have 2 instances of those dragons coming into the play, and you're dealing that extra damage to either the creature or the player instead. Garruk's Uprising is next. It's a copy paste from Colossal Majesty, but whenever it enters the battlefield, you have a creature with power 4 or greater, you draw a card, and your creatures you control have trample. So it gives you a universal effect having trample on your creatures, plus the caveats to give an extra card as long as you have a creature with power 4 or greater when it comes into play. Master Chef is next. This is another one of our backgrounds that we're adding in. For this one, commander creatures you own, this creature enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it, and other creatures you control enter the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on them. So you're basically pumping up your creatures whenever you're playing them. Reflections of Lityara is next. This is a fantastic card to come out of Kaldheim. And obviously, you know that Kaldheim is like one of my favorite sets to come out. But for this, when it enters the field, you choose a creature type, and whenever you cast a creature type, you copy that spell. So this is a amazing synergy with Miirym, as you're getting multiple copies of it. So if you have a Ganax coming on the field, you get to make the copy off Miirym, and you get to make them copy off the Reflections of Lityara. So you have 3 Ganaxes coming into play, and you'll have multiple treasure tokens coming into play. If I'm correct, I think you get 6 treasure tokens from them coming into play. So the last of our enchantments is Temur Ascendancy, and this is just an obvious include, as this is in our colors, and the Ascendancy just works amazing as creatures you control have haste, and whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, you can draw a card. Our penultimate category for this list is our Planeswalkers. This is a deck that doesn't really need Planeswalkers. To be quite honest with you, it could add a couple of extra fun little cards, but for this I wanted to go a little bit on the fun side and add just a couple of strong Planeswalkers I think would suit very well in this deck. Kiora Behemoth Beckoner, as this is basically just another Colossal Majesty or Garruk's Uprising. Whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield, you draw a card. Its -1 is you get to untap target permanent you control for 2, and hybrid green or blue. So this allows you to effectively just untap one of your lands if you want to cast another spell, and with any creature coming to play, you're drawing an extra card off Kiora. And the second one is Sarkhan the Masterless. Its static ability is whenever a creature attacks you or a Planeswalker you control, each dragon you control deals 1 damage to that creature. So forget about attacking, basically. Its +1 is until end of turn, each planeswalker you control becomes a 4/4 red dragon creature and gains flying, which is not exactly exciting for us, but the -3 is pretty good as well, creating a 4/4 red dragon creature token with flying. It starts off as 5 loyalty. Obviously, we're keeping it around basically just for the static ability for having our dragons deal 1 damage to each creature that tries to attack us. Basically, all your dragons are going to be dealing that extra damage to it, so it's not going to come out unscathed, basically. Our last category is our lands. So we're running 35 lands, and like I always mentioned, this is the fuel that runs our deck. Basically, we need these lands in order for us to play the deck. So let's go through this real quick. Command Tower starts us off, giving us a 1 mana of any color in our commander's color identity. Field of Ruin allows us to add a colorless, but its second ability for 2 and tap it and sacrifice the field, destroy target non-basic land an opponent controls, and each player searches their library for a basic land card and puts it on the battlefield. So battlefield, not tapped, keep in mind. Frontier Bivouac comes into play tapped and allows us to tap for our colors. Haven of the Spirit Dragon comes into play. It adds a colorless mana, and you can tap to add 1 mana of any color to spend for dragon spells. Clearly, we're gonna be doing that. And for 2, tap it and sack the Haven. You return target dragon creature card or Ugin Planeswalker card from your graveyard to your hand, which is kind of good because it's the only real recursion we have in our deck. Kessig Wolfrun is an obvious include, especially in big stompy decks like this, where you can add a colorless or X and a red and green and tap it. Target creature gets X+0 and gains trample till end of turn, where you can just go in for a game-ending kill. Mossword Bridge is one of our 2 hideaway lands that basically whenever it comes to play, it first off comes into play tapped, and then you just look at the top 4 and put one of the cards from them underneath the Mossword Bridge to cast later, and then you put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. You can add a green, and for this case, you just tap a green and tap it to play the exiled card without paying the cost, as long as you have total power 10 or greater. With our deck, it's not going to be very difficult to get that. So Mossword Bridge is going to be coming off pretty easy once we put it into play and once we get our dragons on the field. Miirym Landscape, say it with me if you've seen this channel already, comes into play tapped. You add a colorless and then 2, tap it and sacrifice the Miirym Landscape to search your library for 2 basic land cards that share a land type, put them onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle your library. And no, I did not add the other 2. This is the only fetch card that we're running in this deck. Reliquary Tower is not exactly the most useful card, but I wanted to add it in just as an extra spicy little flavor card. You basically have no maximum hand size and gives you an extra colorless to play with. Rogue's Passage is another colorless card for 4 mana and tap it. Target creature can't be blocked this turn, so this land basically lets your creatures give a direct attack, essentially. Spine Rock Knoll is another one of our hideaway lands. This one taps for red, and for red and a tap it, you play the exile card as long as an opponent was dealt 7 or more damage this turn. Temple of the False God comes into play, it gives us 2 mana as long as we have 5 or more lands. And then we round off this list with 8 forests, 8 islands, and 8 mountains.
That's how you build a dragon spirit that knows how to copy stuff and knows how to protect itself. With our deck budget of $50, which includes the price of the commander and excludes the price of the basic lands, and with our overage compromise, we come to a deck total of $53.98, which technically makes this within our budget. Now, as I mentioned before, the $5 overage compromise is there for that $5 wiggle room, and it does help with the deck. Ultimately, there are cards in here that are a little bit overpriced, in my personal opinion, but that's not really for me to say. But ultimately speaking, this just goes to show you can make the deck within a $50 budget with a couple of extra dollars to fill in the gaps. Now let's move forward to our pros and cons and our outer budget suggestions.
So getting into our pros and cons, we're gonna start off with our pros. The first pro I have is that it's super synergistic. Obviously, being said, we have enough cards to justify the synergies that we can have when copying our dragons, especially with all the card draw that I've just named that we can get off it, all the abilities we can get off dragons coming into play, and more and more and more. Plus the fact that our commander enables the copies gives us even more value on the top of it. This deck often ramps very, very fast too. Like, I was able to play Miirym on turn 3. That's how fast this deck can actually go. And to boot, a lot of our ramp actually gives us benefits too. Like the dragon orbs give us so much value in the long run, giving our creatures haste, giving our creatures +1/+1, giving our creatures hexproof, you name it, it's really, really good. And it's very consistent in building up a big board as well. Needless to say, this deck can easily make a dragon army in very little time. Basically, you keep Miirym on the field for maybe 1 or 2 turns, and you already have 3 or 4 extra dragons coming onto the field. So keep in mind, this deck is really synergy happy. This deck profits off all the dragons coming onto play. So keep a very good eye on Miirym as they come into play. If there's one suggestion I would have in the event for this deck, make sure that Miirym does not last the turn. Some of our cons going into this now is that the very glaring one is that it's very likely to draw a lot of hate very early. You're playing a dragon deck first and foremost, so obviously you can play this as Dragon Tribal, which this kind of is, needless to say. But that being said, your commander clones your dragons whenever you come into play, and the amount of synergy we have off this, basically our opponents are going to try to shut it down as early as possible, because if it gets too out of hand, they're not going to be able to stop it, and they can end up just being dead within a couple of turns of Miirym coming into play. That lands can be a problem, as in testing this, I've found a lot of the time I'm either mana flooded or mana screwed, and for the most part, a couple of our lands don't produce the mana that we want it to, or they just come into play tapped, which kind of makes a bit of a hindrance. On the flip side of that, we have a number of non-basic lands coming into play too, especially so. So it could be a bit of a problem if you're searching for certain colors. And the last of our cons that I can really think of is that stacks harms this deck so hard. You just play a couple of cards that don't allow enter the battlefield abilities to trigger, and this deck is pretty done. If you make sure that you have also maybe something like a Winter Orb ability where you can't untap your lands, or Stasis, you skip your untap step, and this deck is completely flushed. You can't really do much upon it. Now, let's get into some of our out of budget recommendations. So this deck, as I showed you before, can be built with a roughly around $50. These cards I'm recommending to you guys if you want to go the extra mile and spend some extra money on it. The first one of my recommendations is Utvara Hellkite. Basically, whenever a dragon you control attacks, you create a 6/6 red dragon token for each creature that's attacking. So keep in mind, Utvara will make a plethora of dragons. And if you have Brutaclad on the field, those dragons are just going to multiply. They stay on the field first and foremost because they don't go at the end of turn. Utvara will be making more dragons, and on your next attack step, basically Utvara Hellkite will trigger again, making even more dragons. And that's just insane value. It's understandable why this would be a $17 card, as this card can go very, very out of hand, even though it is an 8 mana card to play. Next up is Adrix and Nev. I wanted to have a little bit of fun with some of these suggestions. So this one and the next one are kind of in the same realm, under $10. But with Adrix and Nev, this is another card that allows us to create multiple tokens. So with Miirym and Adrix and Nev on the field, you're basically making multiple tokens, and you're going to be profiting off it, especially with the amount of synergy you have with this deck. Next one up is Conjurer's Closet. And you get to blink one of your creatures and get the profit off it on each of your end steps. So you're basically going to be blinking one. As long as it's a non-token, you just blink the non-token dragon. Miirym will see it, get that extra copy on the field, and you get benefit off it. The last of my out-of-budget recommendations for this deck is Doubling Season, but this can be attributed to Doubling Season, Parallel Lives, Primal Vigor, any of those big enchantments that allow you to put multiple tokens onto the battlefield. Doubling Season is just the standard for this, but basically as long as you have Doubling Season, you're going to get multiple copies of dragons on the field. You're set for the game just to completely end by your next turn, because the matter of you profiting off the amount of dragons you're making is just gonna be too much, and you're gonna overwhelm your opponents, and you're gonna win the game with the amount of dragons you're making. Dragontastic!
And I'm going to leave it off there today, guys. What do you guys think of the Miirym deck? And was there any cards I missed out and you want to let me know of? Hit me down in the comments down below. And if you like this kind of content, you want to see more of it, just do me a big favor. All you need to do is like this video, share it with your play group, subscribe to the channel, and hit that bell icon, because that's not only going to notify you of every video that comes out of this channel, I truly appreciate it as well. And not only that, but it's going to help me grow as a content creator here on YouTube and expand out so I can reach more eyes on this kind of subject with more Commander players and more Magic players who want to see this kind of stuff. With that, if you want to follow me on my socials, you'll be on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. You're going to see my Facebook, my Instagram, and my Twitter account. I'm starting to become a little bit more active back on Twitter, and I'm pretty active on Instagram and Facebook. So those are the ways you're gonna get in touch with me. Like I mentioned in the last video, if you don't know why, you can go back and click on that one and just watch the video if you can as well. But I don't really support TikTok anymore, so I've completely eradicated my TikTok account. So if you've already subscribed there, you're not gonna see the channel or the account there anymore. One last thing before I go. Couple of last things before I go. The first of which is I post bi-weekly for the time being. It's just for me to get a couple of things set in stone, and just for me to catch up on a couple of projects I wanted to do. Secondly, next week I'm going to be in Chicago. So if you're in the Chicago area and you want to say hi, I'll be in there for the entire weekend of the 24th to the 27th, because I'm going to go see AEW and New Japan Pro Wrestling Forbidden Door. So if you like Magic and you love wrestling, hit me up. Other than that, thank you guys so much. I truly appreciate it, and thank you guys for watching and subscribing and keeping that view count up. Truly appreciate it. Until the next video that comes out, cheers, everybody.